David E. Ford had $1 billion in the bank and a heart made of stone. When a young waitress accidentally ruined his designer suit, he decided to ruin her life in exchange. But his public display of cruelty was interrupted by a man who didn't care about his money. Geraldino Pisano didn't just stop the humiliation, he revealed a connection between the waitress and the underworld that made the billionaire's blood run cold. By the time David hit the floor, he wasn't just apologizing for a spilled drink, he was begging for his life. You're about to see how one invisible girl became the most powerful person in the room. Jessica Woke thought her shift at the city's most exclusive restaurant would be just another night of working for tips to support her family. Instead, it became the night her dignity was stripped away in front of the very people she served. After a minor accident with a glass of water, billionaire David E. Ford launched into a public tirade, blaming Jessica for his ruined suit and demanding a humiliating apology that no one should ever have to give. But just when it seemed like the room was content to watch a powerful man crush a defenseless girl, a shadow moved from the corner table. Geraldino Pisano, a man whose name is spoken in whispers, stepped forward. He wasn't just there for dinner, he was there to reclaim a debt, and his arrival would ensure that by the end of the night, it wouldn't be Jessica kneeling on the floor. The silence in the restaurant was heavy, suffocating like a thick shroud. Jessica stood paralyzed, the cold water from the shattered glass seeping into her shoes, her face burning with a shame so intense it felt physical. David E. Ford hovered over her, his expensive checkered suit slightly damp, his expression twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated arrogance. "I'm waiting," he sneered, leaning closer so she could smell the expensive cognac on his breath. "Get on your knees and show me you're sorry, or you'll never find work in this city again." Just as Jessica's spirit began to buckle, a sound cut through the tension. Not a shout, but the clinical, heavy thud of a chair being pushed back. From a shadowed corner table that had remained untouched by the chaos, a man stood up. He was tall, his presence expanding to fill the room until David seemed suddenly small by comparison. He wore a black suit that seemed to absorb the light around it, and his eyes, cold and steady, were fixed on the billionaire. "That is quite a performance, David," Geraldino Pisano said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried to every corner of the room. David spun around, his face reddening. "Who the hell are you? This is a private conversation. Mind your own business before I have you thrown out." Geraldino didn't flinch. He walked forward with a slow, predatory grace, his footsteps silent on the marble.
He stopped just inches from David, looking down at him with a terrifyingly calm authority. "Thrown out? That would be difficult," Geraldino murmured. He reached into his coat, not for a weapon, but for a small gold-embossed card, which he tossed onto the table beside David's half-eaten steak. "You see, you are currently standing on the property of the Pisano Trust. I own this restaurant. I own the land beneath your flagship headquarters. And as of 3 o'clock this afternoon, I am the majority debt holder for Ford International." The color drained from David's face so fast it was as if a plug had been pulled. The sneer vanished, replaced by a twitch of pure terror. He knew that name. Everyone in the underworld and the upper world knew Geraldino Pisano. "You like to see people on their knees, don't you?" Geraldino asked, his voice dropping to an even more dangerous whisper. He turned his gaze to Jessica, his expression softening for a fraction of a second before returning to ice. "But you chose the wrong person to break tonight. This girl is under my protection now, and since you're so fond of apologies, I think it's time we saw one." Geraldino placed a heavy hand on David's shoulder, a grip that looked like a caress but felt like a vice. "Apologize to her, David, properly, or I will call in every loan you have before the sun rises." The air in the restaurant had turned brittle, the kind of cold that didn't just touch the skin, but seeped into the marrow. David E. Ford stood frozen, his hand still hovering near the gold-embossed card, as if it were a live wire. The name Pisano echoed in his mind, a name synonymous with quiet endings and absolute power. He looked from the card to Geraldino's face, searching for a hint of a bluff, but he found only the flat, predatory stillness of a man who had already won. You're the silent partner," David stammered, his voice thin and cracking, a far cry from the booming authority he had used on Jessica moments ago. "The holding company in Delaware. That was you." "I don't just hold your debt, David. I hold your breath," Geraldino replied, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it commanded more attention than a shout. He took a half-step closer, his shadow falling completely over the billionaire. "Every luxury you flaunt, every board member you bully, and that glass of cognac in your hand, they all belong to me. And I am a man who dislikes seeing his property used to mistreat someone so much better than the owner." The restaurant was a tomb. The elite patrons who had been snickering into their wine glasses moments ago now looked away, terrified that even witnessing David's downfall would make them the next target. Jessica stood trembling, her hand clutching her apron, her eyes wide as she watched the most powerful man she had ever met begin to crumble.
David's breathing became shallow. He looked at the floor, then at Jessica, then back at the iron-cold gaze of Geraldino. The realization hit him like a physical blow. There was no way out. If Geraldino called in those loans, David wouldn't just be poor, he would be erased. The high-rise offices, the private jets, the reputation he valued more than his soul, it would all vanish by the morning. I didn't know," David whispered, his knees finally betraying him. "Knowledge isn't the requirement for decency," Geraldino said, his hand tightening on David's shoulder, a firm, downward pressure that left no room for negotiation. "Kneel." Slowly, agonizingly, the billionaire's pride broke. The fabric of his checkered suit bunched as he lowered himself, one knee hitting the marble floor with a dull, hollow thud. He sat there, hunched and defeated at the feet of the girl he had tried to destroy. Jessica looked down at him, her chest heaving with a mixture of shock and a sudden sharp clarity. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the one looking up from the bottom. "The words, David," Geraldino prompted, his voice like the click of a hammer on a revolver. "Say them so the whole room hears you." David swallowed hard, his face a bruised shade of purple. "I'm sorry," he choked out, staring at Jessica's water-stained shoes. "I'm so sorry, Jessica. Please, forgive me." Geraldino let go of the man's shoulder as if he were discarding a piece of trash. He turned to Jessica, his expression unreadable but his presence shielding her. "Keep your head up, Jessica. The view is much better from here." The roar of the city faded into a prestigious silence as the sleek black sedan swept through the wrought iron gates of a secluded estate. Jessica sat in the back seat, her hands still trembling in her lap. Beside her, Geraldino Pisano remained an immovable statue of tailored wool and cold resolve. She looked out at the sprawling manor, its stone walls draped in ivy and ancient secrets, feeling like she had stepped out of her life and into a dream that was both beautiful and terrifying. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, the question finally breaking through her shock. "You don't even know me." Geraldino didn't answer until the car came to a smooth halt in front of the grand entrance. He stepped out and held the door for her, a gesture of respect that felt alien to a woman who was used to being invisible. He led her not into a glittering ballroom, but into a dimly lit, wood-paneled study that smelled of old books and expensive tobacco. On the desk sat a single, weathered photograph in a silver frame. "I don't need to know you, Jessica," Geraldino said, his voice softer now, echoing with a weight that suggested he was finally letting a mask slip. He gestured toward the photo. "Because I knew him." Jessica leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. The man in the photo was young, wearing a simple mechanic's uniform, his grease-stained face split by a wide, honest grin. It was a face she saw every time she looked in the mirror, the father she had lost when she was barely 10 years old. "My father worked on your cars," Jessica said, her voice small. "He was a good man, but he was just a mechanic." "He was the man who saved my life," Geraldino countered, his eyes fixing on the image with a rare flicker of emotion. "20 years ago, I was hunted. I was bleeding out in a back alley in the South Side, betrayed by my own blood. Your father didn't ask who I was or what I had done. He didn't care about the price on my head. He hid me in his garage for 3 days, tending to a wound that should have killed me, and he stood between me and the men sent to finish the job." Geraldino turned to her, his gaze intense. "He died a few years later in what they called an accident, but I never forgot the debt. I've spent a decade looking for his daughter, only to find her being trampled by a man who isn't fit to shine her father's boots." He walked to a heavy wall safe, pulled out a thick leather folio, and placed it in her hands. "David Ford thinks you are a waitress. He thinks you are small. He doesn't realize that you are the heir to a legacy of courage that his money could never buy. Tonight, the daughter of Marcus Wolk stops serving. Tonight, you begin to lead." The transformation began not with a dress, but with the shedding of a skin that no longer fit. In a sun-drenched dressing room lined with mirrors that seemed to stretch into infinity, Jessica stared at the white cotton shirt and black polyester apron draped over a velvet chair. For years, that uniform had been her armor and her cage, a garment designed to make her blend into the wallpaper of the wealthy. Now, under the watchful, discerning eye of Geraldino's personal tailors, it looked like a relic from a different life. When she finally stepped out, the reflection staring at her was a stranger. She wore a charcoal gray power suit, the fabric a blend of silk and wool that moved like liquid against her skin. The jacket was tailored with architectural precision, the sharp lines of the shoulders giving her a stature she had never felt before. Her hair, once pinned back in a hasty, practical bun, now fell in polished waves that framed a face no longer clouded by apology. Geraldino stood by the window, watching her with a nod of grim approval. He didn't offer a compliment. In his world, beauty was given, but power was earned. "The suit is the bait, Jessica," his voice echoing off the minimalist walls.
But the trap is in how you carry it. People like David Ford look for the flinch. They look for the way your eyes dart when a room goes quiet. They feast on the hesitation in your voice. He walked toward her, stopping just at the edge of her personal space. The art of the silent threat isn't about shouting. It's about the economy of movement. If you are the most powerful person in the room, you don't need to prove it. You simply exist, and the room adjusts to you. He spent the afternoon teaching her the geometry of command, how to sit without crossing her legs as if to take up less space, how to hold a gaze until the other person is forced to blink, and, most importantly, how to use silence as a weapon. When they ask a question to rattle you, give them nothing but 5 seconds of stillness, Geraldino instructed, his own face a mask of unreadable stone. In those 5 seconds, they will fill the quiet with their own insecurities. They will offer concessions you haven't even asked for. They will realize that while they were talking, you were measuring them for a casket. By sunset, the trembling in Jessica's hands had vanished. She practiced the walk, slow, deliberate, and heavy with the weight of her father's legacy. She wasn't just Marcus Wolk's daughter anymore. She was a woman being forged in the fire of the underworld's greatest strategist. As she caught her reflection one last time, she realized she didn't look like a waitress who had been saved. She looked like a predator who was just beginning to hunt. The glass doors of Ford International didn't just open, they seemed to surrender as Jessica stepped through them. The lobby, a cathedral of chrome and ego, fell silent as she bypassed the security desk with the practiced indifference Geraldino had drilled into her. She wasn't carrying a tray of water tonight. She was carrying the power to erase the man who built this tower. The charcoal gray suit moved with her, a silent declaration of war that matched the steady, rhythmic click of her heels against the polished stone. In the executive elevator, she caught her reflection. The girl who had trembled in the restaurant was gone, replaced by a woman whose eyes held the stillness of a deep, dark well. When the doors opened onto the top floor, David's secretary attempted to stand, her mouth opening to ask for an appointment, but Jessica didn't slow down. She pushed open the double oak doors to the corner office without a knock. David E. Ford was mid-shout, leaning over his mahogany desk into a speakerphone. He looked up, his face reddening as he prepared to bark an order at the intruder, but the words died in his throat. His eyes traveled from her polished shoes to the sharp lines of her jacket, finally landing on her face. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, turning his skin a sickly ashen gray. "You," he whispered, the phone still crackling with the voice of an angry investor. "What are you doing here? This is a restricted area. Security!" Jessica didn't flinch. She walked to the center of the room and pulled out the heavy leather chair opposite him, sitting down with a deliberate, unhurried grace. She didn't cross her legs. She simply leaned back, her hands resting lightly on the armrests, occupying the space as if she had been born to it. She let the silence stretch, counting to 5 just as Geraldino had taught her. She watched David's eyes dart to the door, then to the phone, then back to her, his bravado leaking out of him in real time. "Security won't be coming, David," she said, her voice low and perfectly level. "The Pisano Trust has placed a stay on all executive personnel changes. As of 10 minutes ago, I have been appointed as the majority stake observer for this firm. I am here to oversee the liquidation of your personal assets, to cover the debt you owe my benefactor." David's hands began to shake. He looked down at his desk, at the empire he thought was invincible, and then at the woman he had once tried to force onto her knees. "This isn't legal," he hissed, though the lack of conviction in his voice told a different story. "You're a waitress. You're nothing." Jessica allowed a small, cold smile to touch her lips, a predator's smile. "I'm the person who decides if you leave this building with your car keys or a bus pass, David. Now, sit down. We have a lot of your money to talk about." The following morning, a large rectangular box wrapped in charcoal silk paper sat on the desk that had once belonged to David Ford. It was accompanied by a bouquet of white lilies, the traditional flower of atonement, and a handwritten note that appeared humble, almost broken. "To Jessica, a small token of my sincere regret. May this be the start of a professional grace period. David." Jessica stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, her silhouette sharp against the city skyline, watching the reflection of the box in the glass. She didn't move to open it. She had learned from Geraldino that in the world of power, a gift is rarely a gesture of kindness. It is usually a hook hidden in bait. The door to the office opened, and Geraldino stepped in, his presence bringing a sudden, heavy chill to the room. He didn't look at Jessica. His eyes went straight to the lilies. He walked to the desk, pulled a single white petal from a flower, and crushed it between his thumb and forefinger. "The white lily," Geraldino murmured, his voice a low rasp. "In my world, we send these to funerals. It seems David still thinks he is the one presiding over the service." He gestured for Jessica to open the box. Inside lay a breathtaking vintage necklace, a cascade of emeralds and diamonds that caught the light like trapped fire. It was worth more than Jessica had earned in a decade of waitressing. Along with it was an invitation to the Foundation Gala, the city's most prestigious charity event, where Jessica was listed as the guest of honor. "He wants me to wear this tonight," Jessica said, her voice steady but her mind racing. "He wants the world to see that I've been bought by his apology. If I show up in his jewelry, the board will think I'm back under his thumb." Geraldino leaned over the desk, his gaze scanning the underside of the velvet lining in the jewelry box. With a flick of a small pocket knife, he pried back a hidden seam to reveal a tiny, high-frequency transmitter tucked into the casing. "It's worse than that, Jessica. This necklace was reported stolen from a private collection in Zurich 3 years ago. If you walk into that gala wearing this, the police, who are currently on David's payroll, will arrest you for possession of stolen property before you can even reach the podium. Your reputation would be incinerated before the first course is served." Jessica looked at the glittering emeralds, feeling the cold venom behind the gift. David wasn't just trying to bribe her, he was trying to criminalize her. He wanted to turn the waitress-turned-owner narrative into a thief-exposed scandal. "He expects a victim," Jessica said, turning to face Geraldino. Her eyes were no longer those of the girl who had spilled the water. They were hard, calculating, and bright with a dangerous intelligence. "But I think it's time we showed him that a gift can be returned with interest." Geraldino's lips thinned into a shadow of a smile. "Then we don't call the police. We call the jeweler who originally insured these. And tonight, you won't be wearing his emeralds. You'll be wearing his confession." The foundation gala was a sea of shimmering silk and forced smiles, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and desperate ambition. David E. Ford stood at the center of a small circle of investors, his posture straight, his eyes darting toward the grand entrance every few seconds. He had already alerted his contacts in the precinct. The moment the waitress walked in wearing the stolen emeralds, the handcuffs would click and his boardroom nightmare would be over. When the doors finally swung open, the room fell into a sudden, expectant hush. Jessica stepped into the light, but she wasn't the victim David had imagined. She wore a gown of midnight velvet, its deep blue almost black, and her neck was bare, devoid of the emeralds David had sent. Behind her, walking with the silent, terrifying gravity of a storm cloud, was Geraldino Pisano. David's face paled. This wasn't the plan. He stepped forward, trying to salvage his bravado. "Jessica," he said, his voice straining for a tone of paternal concern, "I noticed you aren't wearing the gift I sent. Was it not to your refined tastes?"
Jessica didn't stop until she was inches away from him. She didn't flinch. She simply looked at him with the same cold, analytical gaze she had used in his office. "The emeralds were beautiful, David," she said, her voice carrying through the silent ballroom. "But I preferred the story they told, specifically the story they told the Swiss authorities when I returned them this afternoon." A murmur rippled through the crowd. David's eyes widened, his hands beginning to shake. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You do," Geraldino's voice cut in, low and lethal. He stepped beside Jessica, placing a heavy hand on David's shoulder, the same grip that had forced him to his knees in the restaurant. "You sent her a necklace stolen 3 years ago, hoping the police you pay for would haul her away tonight. But you forgot one thing, David. I don't just own your debt, I own the men you think are loyal to you." Geraldino signaled to the back of the room. 2 men in dark suits stepped forward, but they weren't the police David expected. They were the insurance investigators from the Zurich firm, accompanied by a federal agent. "The necklace has been recovered," Jessica said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "And the digital signature on the delivery order has been traced back to your private account, David. You didn't just try to frame me, you confessed to a felony in your own handwriting." The social exile was instantaneous. The investors who had been laughing with David seconds ago stepped back as if he were suddenly infectious. The cameras that David had hoped would capture Jessica's arrest now flashed in his face, documenting his frantic, sweating terror. "You're finished, David," Geraldino whispered into his ear. "By morning, your name will be a warning. You wanted her on her knees, but you've managed to bury yourself." As the agents led a shattered David toward the exit, Jessica stood tall, her head held high. She didn't look at the man being taken away. She looked at the room full of people who had once looked through her, and for the first time, she saw them all blink first. The adrenaline of the gala had begun to cool, replaced by the deep, rhythmic hum of the city at midnight.
High above the streets, on the expansive stone balcony of Geraldino's estate, the air was crisp and smelled of rain and distant jasmine. Jessica stood at the railing, her midnight velvet gown catching the silver glow of the moon. She looked down at the sprawling lights of the metropolis, no longer feeling like a girl lost in its shadows, but like the woman who finally held its keys. The heavy glass door slid open behind her, and the familiar measured footfalls of Geraldino Pisano echoed against the stone. He didn't stand beside her, he leaned against a pillar, his silhouette sharp against the interior light of the study. For the first time since they had met, he looked tired, the lines around his eyes etched deep by a life lived in the trenches of power.
David is processed, Geraldino said, his voice a low rasp that the wind almost carried away. His accounts are frozen. By morning, the board will formally ratify your position. There will be no more traps, Jessica, not from him. Jessica turned to him, the moonlight reflecting in eyes that had lost their flicker of fear. I couldn't have done it without you. You gave me the suit, the lessons, the leverage. I still feel like I'm standing on your shoulders. Geraldino shook his head slowly, a ghost of a smile touching his thin lips. I gave you the tools, but you were the one who knew how to strike. Tonight, when you looked at David, you didn't look at me for permission. You didn't wait for a sign. You saw the opening and you took it with a coldness that even I didn't teach you. He walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small iron key, old, heavy, and unadorned. He placed it on the stone railing between them. This belongs to a private vault at the Pisano Trust. It contains the legal deeds to your father's original garage, along with the titles to the land David tried to steal. It's all yours, fully legitimate, unrestricted. Why are you giving me this now? Jessica asked, her voice tight. The work isn't finished. The work of a protector is never finished, Jessica, but my part in it is, Geraldino replied, his gaze fixing on the horizon. A week ago, you were a girl who needed a shadow to hide in. Tonight, you became the shadow that others will fear. You don't need me to stand between you and the world anymore. You've become the wall. He looked at her then, not as a mentor looking at a student, but as an equal. Your father saved my life with his hands. You saved his legacy with your mind. I am going away for a while, to a place where the air is cleaner than this city. When I return, I expect to hear your name spoken with the same respect and the same caution as mine. He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. Remember the silent threat, Jessica. You don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to be the only person in the room who isn't afraid of the dark. As the door clicked shut, Jessica picked up the iron key. It was cold and heavy, the weight of a new life. She looked back out at the city, a protector in her own right, ready for the dawn. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of the cemetery, a soft gray veil that muted the colors of the world. Jessica walked along the gravel path, her long black coat sweeping against the dew-kissed grass. Her footsteps were no longer the hurried, uneven pacer of a girl afraid of her own shadow. They were rhythmic, heavy with a quiet authority that commanded the silence around her. She stopped before a simple, polished granite headstone. There were no flashy titles or grand declarations of power carved into the stone, only a name and 2 dates. Geraldino Pisano. Jessica knelt, not out of a demand for submission, but out of a deep, abiding respect. She placed a single white lily upon the base of the grave. I'm still wearing the suit, Geraldino, she whispered, her voice steady against the morning breeze. But I don't need it to feel the weight of my own shoulders anymore. In the months since the gala, the city had shifted beneath her feet. David Ford's empire had been dismantled, his name scrubbed from the glass towers he once worshipped, but Jessica hadn't stopped at just taking his seat. She had returned to the restaurant where it all began, not as a ghost of her past, but as the new owner. She had kept the staff, tripled their wages, and made sure that no one who walked through those doors would ever be made to feel invisible again.
She had become the protector Geraldino knew she was, a silent force that balanced the books of justice in a world that usually only cared about the bottom line. She stood up, brushing a stray leaf from her coat. She felt the iron key in her pocket, a cold reminder of the legacy she now carried. She wasn't just Marcus Wolk's daughter, and she wasn't just a mafia boss's protege. She was the woman who had learned that true power isn't found in making others kneel. It's found in having the strength to stand up when everyone else is waiting for you to fall. As she turned to leave, the sun began to break through the clouds, catching the gold band of a ring she wore, a gift she had bought for herself to mark the day she officially took over the Pisano Trust. She walked back toward her car, a sleek black sedan that waited for her like a loyal hound. She didn't look back. There was no need to look at the shadows when she was the one casting them now. The girl who had dropped the tray was gone, buried under the weight of 1,000 choices and the ironclad lessons of a man who saw her before she saw herself. Jessica Wolk drove back toward the city, ready to face the dawn, knowing that in the room of her life she would never again be the one who blinked first. The rain had finally washed away the morning mist, leaving the cemetery air crisp and smelling of turned earth and renewal. Jessica stood by her car for a long moment, looking back at the quiet green hills. She realized that while Geraldino had given her the keys to an empire, the true gift was the silence she now carried within herself, the kind of silence that didn't come from being hushed, but from having nothing left to prove.
As she drove back toward the heart of the city, she passed the construction site where David Ford's name was being chiseled off the granite facade of his former headquarters. It was being replaced by a simple, elegant emblem, a stylized gear intertwined with a rising phoenix. It was the new logo for the Wolk Foundation, a venture dedicated to providing legal and financial protection for service workers who had been mistreated by the powerful. She arrived at the restaurant just as the lunch rush was beginning. The maitre d' bowed his head respectfully, not out of fear, but out of genuine kinship. Jessica walked through the kitchen, checking on the line cooks, offering a quiet word of encouragement to a new server who looked overwhelmed. She stopped at the very spot where she had once collapsed in shame. The marble had been polished until it shone like a mirror. She looked at her reflection. She saw a woman who knew that true authority wasn't about the sharpness of a suit or the weight of a bank account. It was about the ability to look at the world and refuse to let it break you. She took her seat at the corner table, the one Geraldino had occupied on that fateful night. She didn't need to say a word. The restaurant hummed around her, a perfectly tuned machine of dignity and respect. Jessica Wolk picked up her menu, the iron key resting safely in her pocket, and looked out at the door. She was ready to protect the next person who walked through it. The moral lesson, the power of the invisible. The story of Jessica and Geraldino serves as a powerful reminder of 3 fundamental truths. 1. Status is temporary, character is permanent. David Ford believed his wealth gave him the right to devalue another human being. However, his power was a house of cards built on debt and arrogance. True power, as shown by Jessica's father and later Jessica herself, is found in integrity and the courage to stand firm when it is least convenient. 2. The underestimated are often the most dangerous. The world often overlooks those in service positions, the waitresses, the mechanics, the invisible workers. This story highlights that these individuals often possess a resilience and observational intelligence that elite figures lack. When an underdog is given the right tools, their transformation is unstoppable because they have already survived the worst. 3. Justice is a debt that must be paid. Geraldino's intervention wasn't just a random act of kindness, it was the fulfillment of a life debt. It teaches us that no act of goodness, like Marcus Wolk saving a stranger, is ever truly lost. Kindness is a seed that even decades later can grow into a forest of protection for the next generation.